I once watched a man stare at a plaque for nearly a full minute before deciding it was wrong. Not damaged. Not unclear. Wrong. It marked the opening of a bridge built before his country even existed. He reread the date, then laughed softly and said, "That can't be right." I asked why. He pointed at the year and replied, "If people were this advanced back then, we'd have heard about it." That moment told me everything. Not about history, but about how some people measure progress. If an achievement isn't recent, it feels irrelevant. If it isn't familiar, it feels exaggerated. And if it didn't happen where they expect, it quietly gets downgraded from remarkable to suspicious. That bridge didn't fail engineering. It failed expectation. And once I noticed that pattern, I started seeing it everywhere. Before we go further, if you enjoy stories that look at history without the usual filters, you might want to subscribe. I post regularly, and this channel is exactly about moments like this. I was volunteering as a guide at a small maritime museum in the north of England when I discovered something unexpected. Maps, it turns out, can be offensive objects. Not wrong. Not misleading. Offensive. We had a large wall map on display showing historic trade routes, empires, and borders across different centuries. Everything was clearly labeled. Dates were precise. Nothing vague. An American tourist stood in front of it for a long time. Arms folded. Leaning back slightly, the posture of someone judging a piece of art they don't like. Eventually, he turned to me and said, "This map feels wrong." I asked what he meant. He pointed straight at Europe. "It's too crowded," he said. "The countries are way too small." I explained that Europe developed with dense populations, constantly shifting borders, and independent states forming over thousands of years. He slowly shook his head. "I don't buy that," he said. "If this were true, people wouldn't have fought so much. They would have merged earlier." I nodded politely, while silently wondering how you argue with someone who thinks geography should work like corporate mergers. At a medieval castle in Wales, I once watched an American family explore a stone keep built in the early 1200s. The children were fascinated. The parents, less so. The father ran his hand along the rough stone wall and asked, "So this is the original? You never renovated it?" I explained that preserving history often means not modernizing it. He frowned. "Seems inefficient," he said. "Back home we'd add elevators. Maybe glass panels. Make it more accessible." His wife nodded. "It feels frozen in time." That was the point. The castle wasn't frozen because Britain failed to improve it. It was preserved because history isn't meant to be optimized. Still, the disappointment on his face suggested we'd missed an opportunity, preferably one involving climate control and a gift shop on every floor. While leading a walking tour in London, I pointed out a street that still follows the path of a Roman road laid nearly 2,000 years ago. Locals barely notice it. Tourists usually find it impressive. One American man raised his hand almost immediately. "Does that really count as a road?" he asked. I said yes. "I mean," he clarified, "it's just stones. No asphalt. No markings. No lanes." I explained that Roman roads were engineering marvels for their time, and that many modern roads still sit directly on top of them. He shook his head. "Feels more like a path than an invention," he said. "Anyone could have done that." I didn't point out that most people didn't, and that this path outlasted entire civilizations. Some inventions only seem obvious after they've worked for 2,000 years. After enough encounters like this, a pattern begins to emerge. It isn't ignorance. It isn't arrogance either. At least not consciously. It's something quieter. Structural. Many Americans grow up inside a narrative where progress is linear, recent, and national. If something is impressive, it must be modern. If it's modern, it must be American. Older achievements feel incompatible with innovation, especially when they come from places labeled historic rather than dynamic. So when ancient infrastructure still works, the brain doesn't reject the fact. It downgrades the achievement. Simple. Basic. Obvious. That isn't historical analysis. That's psychological self-defense. In Scotland, I once overheard an American couple, at a science museum discussing early medical practices. "It's interesting," one of them said, "but it all feels outdated." The exhibit explained how these methods saved lives before antibiotics existed. I mentioned that these practices laid the groundwork for modern medicine. The woman nodded politely, then added, "I just mean we wouldn't do it that way now." That was true. We also wouldn't build airplanes out of wood, but that doesn't make the Wright brothers irrelevant. The issue wasn't the content, it was the timeline. If progress isn't recent, it feels irrelevant. If it isn't American, it feels optional. History becomes something you walk through, not something you stand on. At a transportation exhibit in Manchester, I explained how early canal systems transformed trade. An American visitor listened carefully, then said, "That's clever. But it's kind of obvious, right? Dig water. Float things. Done." I asked why no one had done it at scale before. He shrugged. "Probably just timing." Timing, of course, is invention. The fact that something feels obvious now doesn't make it less revolutionary then. But once an innovation feels simple, it stops feeling impressive. Complexity earns praise. Quiet effectiveness gets dismissed as accidental. At an industrial heritage site, an American man stared at a timeline comparing European and American developments. "This doesn't match what I learned," he said. I asked which part. He pointed at the early dates. "It just feels like Europe is being placed ahead too early. Not incorrect. Not false. Just uncomfortably early." Facts that disrupt identity often feel wrong even when they're accurate. When history challenges a worldview, the instinct isn't to update the worldview. It's to question the history. For many people, national history isn't information. It's identity reinforcement. So when evidence shows leadership rotated, progress was shared, or innovation happened elsewhere first, it doesn't land as trivia. It lands as contradiction. And contradictions don't get processed calmly. They get minimized, reframed, negotiated until emotional balance returns. While guiding a group through a small local museum, we reached an exhibit on medieval timekeeping. Church calendars, feast days, agricultural cycles. One American visitor leaned in and squinted. "This feels confusing," he said. "Why didn't they just simplify it?" I explained that timekeeping evolved around farming, religion, and seasons, not productivity software. He nodded slowly. "Still feels inefficient," he said. "Like they didn't plan ahead." I resisted, explaining that planning ahead is easier when electricity exists. For him, complexity meant failure. If a system wasn't streamlined, it must be underdeveloped. History wasn't wrong. It was just inconvenient. On a walking tour through a university town, I casually mentioned that lectures had been held in one stone building since the early 1400s. Most people nodded. One American student stopped walking. "Wait," he said. "Continuously?" I told him yes. Same institution. Same purpose. Same academic lineage. He looked unsettled. "So, is it still accredited?" he asked quietly, like he was checking expired food. I assured him it was. That didn't relax him. "I just mean," he said, "how do you know the education still works if it's that old?" I explained that knowledge isn't software. It doesn't stop functioning because it wasn't updated last year. The institution survived wars, plagues, and political collapse, adapting without erasing itself. He nodded, but I could see the disconnect. In his framework, age meant decay. Longevity felt suspicious, not impressive. During another city tour, an American woman pointed at a narrow street barely wide enough for one car. "Why are your streets like this?" she asked, clearly annoyed. I explained they were built centuries before automobiles existed. She frowned. "Okay, but why didn't you fix them later?" I told her cities here revolve around history, instead of replacing it. That answer didn't satisfy her. "That would never work back home," she said. She wasn't talking about traffic. She was rejecting the idea that infrastructure could value continuity over efficiency. To her, permanence meant failure. At a crafts museum, I explained how early textile looms transformed regional economies. An American man listened attentively, nodding along. Then he asked, "But could it scale?" I asked what he meant. "Like globally," he said. "Could this really grow?" I explained that, for its time, it already had reshaping labor, trade, and cities across continents. He still looked unconvinced. "Feels small," he said. The invention didn't fail historically. It failed his modern startup pitch. If it didn't resemble Silicon Valley growth, it didn't feel legitimate. And while discussing historical labor laws, one American visitor asked, genuinely curious, not hostile, "Why did workers have so many protections? Doesn't that slow everything down?" I explained that these laws didn't appear randomly. They emerged after industrial disasters, after exploitation, after mass strikes that made suffering impossible to ignore. He nodded, genuinely sympathetic, then asked, "But isn't flexibility better?" The question wasn't cruel. It came from a worldview where speed equals progress. Safeguards felt like friction instead of achievement. Protection looked inefficient when everything was measured only by output. I was later explaining the work of a British civil engineer, someone whose designs quietly shaped modern life. Bridges, tunnels, water systems, not a household name. No statues. No Hollywood film. An American visitor listened briefly, then asked, "So why haven't I heard of him?" I gave the obvious answer. "Because he didn't work in America." That didn't sit well. "But if he were really that important," the man replied, "he'd be famous." I pointed out that impact and fame aren't the same thing. Many people change the world without becoming brand names. He nodded politely, but the idea didn't land. In his framework, visibility meant significance. If history didn't cross the Atlantic, it barely counted. Entire systems could exist, function, and shape daily life, but without recognition, they felt optional. At a social history exhibit focused on labor movements, housing reform, and poverty, an American woman leaned toward her friend and whispered, "This is kind of depressing." The displays weren't sensational. They were factual. Working conditions, child labor, long hours, slow reform. I explained that these exhibits showed why protections exist today. She nodded, then added, "I just prefer museums that celebrate success." I asked what she meant by success. She paused. Achievements. Progress. Wins. Some cultures treat history like a trophy shelf. Others treat it like a record. This museum wasn't trying to inspire pride. It was trying to explain consequences. That difference made her uncomfortable. Near the end of many tours, someone eventually asked the same question. It always comes softly, almost apologetically. "So why don't we learn this back home?" I usually answer honestly. Because your education system focuses on your national story. The silence afterward is always heavier than expected. It lands as realization, not accusation, because it's never really about trains, streets, or inventors. It's about realizing the world didn't revolve around you for most of its existence, and that progress happened everywhere. Often simultaneously. Often without permission. At an industrial heritage site, an American man stared at a long timeline comparing European and American development. He didn't point to a specific detail. He just said, "This feels off." I asked which part. He gestured vaguely at the early dates. "It feels like you're putting Europe ahead too early. Not incorrectly. Not falsely. Just uncomfortably early." Facts that disrupt identity often feel wrong, even when they're correct. When history challenges a worldview, the instinct isn't to update the worldview. It's to question the history. Cultural memory isn't neutral. It amplifies familiar names. It filters out the rest. What gets taught feels important. What gets repeated feels true. When importance is assumed to equal fame, entire chapters of global history disappear. Not erased. Just quietly ignored. What remains isn't the past as it happened. It's the version that feels safest to believe. At a transportation museum, I explained how early public transit systems worked. Trams, shared carriages, scheduled routes designed to move large populations efficiently through growing cities. An American visitor listened for a while, then frowned. "This feels backwards," he said. I asked what he meant. Why wouldn't everyone just have their own vehicle? I explained that mass transit existed because private transport wasn't practical or affordable for most people at the time. He nodded slowly, but I could see resistance forming. To him, shared systems felt like compromise. Progress meant individual ownership. Anything collective looked temporary, something people tolerated until something better arrived. The idea that efficiency could come from cooperation didn't feel intuitive. It felt provisional. While discussing historical engineering standards, an American tourist asked why Europe adopted the metric system. "Feet and inches just make more sense," he said confidently. "They feel more natural." I explained that metric measurements were designed to be consistent, scalable, and universal. He shook his head. "I don't know. It feels forced." What he meant was unfamiliar. Standards only feel natural when you grow up with them. But instead of recognizing that, comfort became proof of correctness. The system didn't fail logically. It failed emotionally. At a historic bridge site, I explained how the structure transformed regional trade. An American visitor admired it briefly, then asked how long it took to build. When I told him, his eyebrows rose. "That's it?" He expected grandeur measured in size, not impact. "Back home we'd make it bigger," he said. I explained that engineering isn't about excess. It's about solving the problem you actually have. But restraint didn't register as intelligence. It read as lack of ambition. The idea that something could be transformative without being massive didn't fit his internal scale of success. While explaining how early social systems pooled resources for public benefit, water access, sanitation, shared services, an American visitor asked, "So people were okay paying for things they didn't personally use?" I said yes. He laughed, assuming I was joking. When he realized I wasn't, his expression changed. "That's strange," he said. "Why would anyone agree to that?" Because the benefit wasn't individual. It was societal. But for someone raised inside a framework where value is measured personally, collective logic feels suspicious. Cooperation looks like loss rather than investment. Individualism is powerful. It drives innovation, risk-taking, responsibility. But it also becomes a filter. When collective systems appear, they aren't judged by outcomes. They're judged by whether they align with identity. And if they don't, the instinct isn't to understand them. It's to dismiss them as inefficient, outdated, or unnecessary.